75 years ago, much of Afro-American culture was centered around cotton fields like these. And then, for 5 decades, beginning in 1915, blacks undertook the largest single migration of any ethnic group in our country's history. Chicago became one of the largest recipients in what has become known as the Great Migration. The people, the customs, and the culture of the migrants have had a tremendous impact in shaping the city of Chicago as what we know it today. The seeds of the Great Migration were planted nearly a century ago when Chicago hosted the Columbian Exposition in 1893.
There had been a constant migration, a trickle, ever since the city was formed in the 19th century, early 19th century. Township status, 1833, city status, 1837. But the spark occurred with the Columbian Exposition, a real pull factor for people who wanted to take advantage of the opportunities of a major metropolis.
This migration apparently didn't attract the working class.
Yeah, the working class came very slowly. The problem for the working class was that Chicago's industry was shut off to blacks.
Before World War I, when Chicago industrialists wanted to hire workers, they looked to European immigrants. They believed that blacks were incapable of doing industrial work. It was an honest belief that they held. Industrialists and most other Americans at that time saw the world in terms of races and racial capabilities. So there was the Italian race and the Slavic race and the Jewish race. And industrial managers believed that each race had its own peculiar capabilities, and that the black race did not have any capabilities which were appropriate to industrial work. So the only time they hired blacks were when they needed strike breakers, and then immediately after the strike they would be fired.
At the turn of the century, 2/3 of the country's Afro-Americans lived in the rural South. Few blacks owned their own land. Most worked under some form of the sharecropping system, where landlords would front supplies and living expenses in return for a portion of the crops at harvest time. For most sharecroppers, like Erling Lindsay's father in Fitchwood, Alabama, their crops never seemed to cover expenses.
And didn't care what he made, he never got out of debt. He always owed something at the end of the year.
Cotton was an important crop throughout the South. Its 7-month growing season culminated in the scorching months of August and September.
Have you ever had to work in the field from sunup to sundown, and you see a spot in the cloud in the sky and pray that it rains so you can get some rest? My aspiration was, regardless of what it took, that I didn't have to chop cotton, pick cotton, harvest corn, or anything else anymore. I was willing to take that chance. And I think that's what I was just tired.
Cotton plants grow about waist high. Picking cotton by hand requires bending over or crawling on hands and knees. The sacks each picker carried for the collected cotton often weighed as much as 200 pounds by the end of the day.
I'd get on my knees sometime and pick, crawl on your knees. You had knee pads on. Crawl on your knees. I'd get 2 rows.
During the early decades of this century, most sharecroppers lived on the land they farmed. Few could afford to travel, which limited their communication with the rest of the world.
When you was used to such work as that, it was great. You knew no better.
About 70 miles south of Memphis, Clarksdale, Mississippi sits right in the heart of the Mississippi Delta. The rich topsoil and warm climate in this area have always been well suited for growing cotton. Like the rest of the South, Clarksdale segregated its black and white citizens through the early 70s. Like most towns in the Mississippi Delta and throughout the South, blatant signs of segregation disappeared around Clarksdale when federal law mandated it some 2 decades ago. For the first half of this century, separate but equal was the official law, but each town devised their own interpretation. When do you recall that you were first aware that racism existed?
The first time, I believe, was when my father bought some hunting dogs, because that was the part of the way that we ate and we lived from him hunting. And he bought some hunting dogs, and these white folks wanted to buy his dogs. And he wouldn't sell them his dogs, and they come along and poison the dogs. And I think that just had a great impact on me as to how far white folks would go to keep control over black folks' lives.
How much did segregation in the South impact your life?
We had separate schools, no school bus. We had to walk to 6 miles where the white school bus picked the kids up and sometimes chase us off the road. We could not walk through the middle of the town to go up on the hill, what they call Baptist Hill, to go to Hale County Training School. We had to walk in the back where they didn't even have sidewalks or nothing. And can you imagine walking in that red mud? Going up, had to go up the back of town in order to go to Baptist Hill, and then we had to walk those 6 miles back home. And I think that's when you really felt and knew the difference. And if you went into a store somewhere, you try to make a telephone call, and unless you said yes ma'am and no ma'am, they would not wait on you.
During the years between World War I and World War II, talk about a better life began to trickle through the South. The Promised Land up north offered more opportunity than they had in the South.
You can't separate segregation from sharecropping, from people not having any rights within the legal system, from the threat of violence. These are all part of a social fabric in the South. And what people perceived was that this was a social fabric that did not permit them any opportunity to become all that they could be, to use a more contemporary phrase. And they perceived that in the North, industrial work opened up the possibilities to full citizenship because of the availability of this kind of work, which had higher wages, but also because they could send their children to school, to better schools than they could in the South, to schools that were open longer. They could vote. They could walk into a store and try on a hat.
During World War II, an event took place in a Mississippi cotton field that would trigger the second and largest wave of black migration. We'll explore these changes in the cotton culture and their effect on Chicago when we return. On October the 2nd, 1944, in this field just outside Clarksdale, Mississippi, a few thousand people gathered for an event that would dramatically impact Chicago, 600 miles to the north. The unveiling of the mechanical cotton picker would eventually idle thousands of black workers and accelerate their exodus to Chicago. In the early 1940s, two brothers owned and managed a 4,000-acre plantation 2 miles south of Clarksdale, Mississippi. One of those brothers, Howell Hobson, had been working with the Chicago-based International Harvester Company for 15 years, developing and testing various designs for a machine that could pick cotton. Roosevelt Hill, who was born and raised on the Hobson farm, drove many of the early prototypes.
The first picker would go down through the field. It didn't pick as good as you would take a stick just knocking it out. But on in terms that they would write up their report, what they need to improvement, go back this fall, come back the next fall with something else.
Once perfected, the cost of picking cotton dropped from $42 per bale for hand picking to around $5 per bale with a mechanical cotton picker. Though this mechanized farming didn't become universal until the 1950s, for those blacks who relied on cotton for a living, the handwriting was on the wall. Blues musician Johnny Billington grew up in rural Mississippi and earned extra income working the cotton fields.
Yeah, it was a lot of people that was talking about it, although I was real young, but they realized that if it did work, then it would eliminate a whole lot of jobs for people in the South.
Sharecroppers worked their tails off. They weren't people with a bad work ethic. These were people who knew how to work. They were accustomed to working. If you didn't work, you didn't eat. These simply were not people accustomed to handouts, and they came to Chicago, they came to work. They came here to work in packing houses. They came here to work in steel mills. And this continues right through World War II. When people came here during World War II, they came here for those jobs. It does change to some extent with the mechanical cotton picker. What the mechanical cotton picker does is it creates refugees. The migrants that I'm talking about are not refugees. They're a selected population. They're people who make a decision that things are better there than they are here. With the cotton picker, you get refugees. You get people who are thrown off the land, people who no longer can survive.
Like scores of other blacks in Clarksdale and around the Mississippi Delta, Ruby Haynes contemplated a move north during the 40s.
A lot of friends of mine I know started leaving here in 39, 38 and 39, 40, 41, 43. People would just start leaving, you know. So it'd take me a long time to make up my mind to go there.
Why did you want to move to Chicago?
I think when they started getting the cotton pickers in for the plantation, because most of the people, that's how they would make their living. Most of the way to go pick cotton and chop cotton. But when they started getting those machines in, it cut out all the people. They didn't have no kind of work to do. People that wasn't able to work in a laundry or at a white person house or something like that, that was just the way they lived. And they just left to go find better jobs.
Education in the rural South often meant one room with a part-time teacher and a school schedule that revolved around farming chores. As a young child, Benny Mae Tillman showed signs of being an exceptional student, but her parents didn't feel their school in rural Arkansas could provide the challenge she needed.
I remember my schooling because just before I left, I had received this double from 3rd to 4th grade. And that's one of the things that influenced my father and mother to want to come to Chicago, because my teachers had told them that I had possibilities and they wanted to give me the best opportunity possible. And some of their friends had come north and told them that it was a great place to be.
In addition to the educational opportunities in the North, Benny Mae Tillman's father was able to find a better job to support their 9 children. Chicago's black population grew from 2% of the total in 1910 to over 50% of the entire city's population today. The largest influx of blacks into Chicago occurred after World War II.
The cotton picker started running off the production lines of International Harvester in 1944, late 1944. That basically caused a lot of field hands to be thrown out of work, and then at the same time, Chicago and cities like Chicago were just booming with jobs. You could get to Chicago from Mississippi and get a job overnight, or faster than overnight, unskilled and making 4 times what you had been making in Mississippi.
The pull factor was the factor of economic opportunity. There was also an accompanying push factor. People were being killed and beaten and always intimidated in the South. In addition, those who were very assertive had to watch what they said in the South, were denied the right to vote, had no freedom of opportunity in regard to education for their children or themselves. So that push factor added to that particular factor of pull, you know, economic opportunities, really explains why so many came and why so many stayed.
Without knowledge of the opportunities that existed in Chicago, the migration would have never happened. We'll look at how Southern blacks learned about the Promised Land when we return. Remnants of the old sharecroppers' quarters can still be found throughout the South. Often families of 10 or more lived in crowded one-room cabins like these. No wonder then that when word filtered down about a better life in Chicago, it opened up the floodgates of migration to the Promised Land on the shores of Lake Michigan. Prior to World War I, European immigrants made up the labor force for Chicago industry. Many of these factory workers went to war in 1914, leaving a void in the factories. industrialists looked south for a new source of unskilled labor.
For a very short period, the U.S. government was in the South encouraging blacks to come north to work, to fill these slots in industry, meat packing, steel, what have you, that were open and necessary to the war effort, providing war material to the warring allies. Big companies went south. Sometimes they even took tickets with them. Sometimes they took railroad cars, and brought workers back with them.
During the war, some companies sent professional labor agents into the South to recruit workers for the factories.
This did not last very long. It did last long for cities other than Chicago. If you were an industrialist in Milwaukee or in Beloit or in Rockford and you wanted to hire black workers and recruit them in the South, you had to send a labor agent, because who in Mississippi had ever heard of Rockford? Very quickly, though, Chicago industrialists didn't need to send labor agents. The process really began to feed on itself as people sent back. They would come to Chicago, they'd send back letters, they'd go back and visit. If you come up to Chicago, you're not going to go back and visit until you've made it. The people who haven't made it aren't going to go back and show people what failures they are. The people who go back are the ones who come up, do well, buy some nice clothes, go back wearing those nice clothes with presents for everybody. That's an advertisement for the city.
A newspaper, the Chicago Defender, also played a major role in spreading the word about Chicago's virtues. Robert Abbott, the paper's founder and owner, migrated to Chicago from Savannah, Georgia during the Columbian Exposition in the 1890s. He founded the Defender in 1905, and it reflected his deep concern for injustices toward Afro-Americans in the North and South.
The Chicago Defender had a platform, a nine-point platform at its inception, and one of those was that race prejudice must be destroyed in the United States of America. So in that process, racial discrimination for the disenfranchised, if you will, was rampant in the South and not so much in the North in those times. So Mr. Abbott used the Chicago Defender. The Chicago Defender is known as a beacon. In that process, we were able to have our paper address those issues of the disenfranchised that were not only in the South but also in the North, and to tell them they could come to Chicago relative to for less racial discrimination and better employment opportunity.
Abbott had a tremendous feel, I think, for his constituency. For example, Abbott was the first one to recognize the marketing power of Pullman porters and African-American entertainers. And this was in the early teens when the paper really began to do well. What Abbott did was he started a special column for Pullman porters. And on the editorial page, he also talked about how they were underpaid. He also was one of the first to start special pages for entertainers. And what he got in return was Pullman porters and traveling black entertainers carrying the newspaper through the South. And that's how, and even not just Pullman porters entertainers, but even black baseball teams would bring the newspaper south as they would barnstorm through the South.
With the Defender's militant stance, constant exposure of injustices, and sensationalism, Southern whites often confiscated or banned the paper.
That is what the European Americans in the South did not want the people, the African Americans in the South, to read. So what happened? We can again say it was almost against the law, because if you were caught reading the Chicago Defender, especially being African American in the South, something very serious could happen to you, even as much as losing your life.
The Defender's rapid increase in circulation paralleled the beginning of the migration. It escalated from a circulation of 33,000 in 1916 to 130,000 3 years later. By 1919, the Defender shipped to over 1,500 locations throughout the South. Many towns outlawed the paper, so it was often smuggled in.
If you lived in Chicago and you had relatives or friends in the southern states, you would mail the Chicago Defender to your friends in the South, but you wouldn't mail the Chicago Defender. You would take another metropolitan newspaper and weave the Chicago Defender throughout it, and then mail that paper to the South.
By the late 40s and early 50s, Chicago needed no further promotion. 5 million blacks migrated from the South to northern cities in the 3 decades following World War II. Chicago's black population grew so fast, many referred to the South Side as the black capital of the United States.
The migration is phenomenal also because the blacks who came here sometimes came as parts of towns. Maybe a whole church picked up, maybe half the town picked up. And many times, half the town would pick up, these are small towns, would pick up at night and flee down the railroad tracks to catch the train 20 miles beyond the town so they could get out of town, because there were policemen at work to keep blacks from leaving certain parts of the South.
Next up, the journey north to Chicago. I'm fed up with the Jim Crow laws, people who are cruel and afraid, who lynch and run, who are scared of me and me of them. I pick up my life and take it away on a one-way ticket. Gone up north, gone out west, gone. The haunting verse of American poet Langston Hughes sums up the exasperation felt by many Southern blacks. Once they decided to leave, rail travel was their primary means of escape. Today, the original station is boarded up, and the tracks that connected New Orleans lay dormant. But the memories of those train rides still live on.
We didn't have any comfortable means of sleeping on the train, so we sat up. It must have taken a couple of days to get here.
I think I paid $11. And it was all right until, you know, black people then would have a certain coach to ride.
Had to make our sandwiches and bring them with us. You couldn't go to the dining area. That was the, but I took that with a grain of salt. I never let it faze me.
The main Illinois Central rail line ran from New Orleans to Chicago. Along that route, railroad lines from Georgia and Alabama joined the IC tracks to Chicago. For the entire duration of this migration, which tapered off in the mid-60s, blacks and whites rode the trains north in separate railroad cars. Earlene Lindsay made her first trip to Chicago in 1943.
You only could ride the train if seats was available, because soldiers would ride in the trains then. And sometimes they would let you get on the train, but you would have to sit on your luggage or sit somewhere. And they would tell you, now when we get to Kentucky, pull down your shades. Because you see, they had black coaches and white coaches. And sometime if you rode with the soldiers sitting on those suitcases just to get on the train, it might have been a mixed audience. You know, it might have been black and white. And people would throw bricks through the train window. And that was the reason to pull down the shades so they couldn't see who was in what caboose on the train.
Once the train reached Cairo, Illinois, segregation officially ended. But few changed railroad cars for the remainder of the trip to Chicago. Weren't you bothered by the fact that even though you were in the North, you still had to take a segregated train from Chicago?
No, because you know why? I had just come out of a segregated living. And it don't bother you as much. And plus, I guess my father, when he talked about the man and the monkey on his back, had just kind of prepared us that regardless of where we go, because of the color of our skin, we would always be classified as different.
I read Frederick Douglass and all of the fellows from the olden times, and I knew what segregation meant. And it didn't faze me, because I was looking beyond segregation. I could do more things in Chicago than I could do in Memphis. And I lived in Memphis under strict segregation law. And I felt that I could work with the situation.
The vast majority of blacks migrating from the South arrived in Chicago by train, and the end of the Illinois Central line stood right here at 12th and Michigan. The Illinois Central station was the Black Ellis Island until it was demolished in 1974.
Many times they found just what they expected to find. They found friendly relatives ready to greet them and jobs. And the jobs were very demanding, but the jobs were well-paying for persons who had been underpaid working in the fields of the South or in small southern towns. They found educational opportunities. The opportunities they thought existed were here. And perhaps the biggest disappointment might have been in the area of housing, where African Americans found themselves squeezed into a housing situation that didn't promise anything better for them and their children.
We'll examine this budding black metropolis when we return.
We were accustomed to speaking to people on the streets. We were accustomed to various families concerned about other families. When we got here, we found out that you lived in your, what they call flats at that time, and they lived in theirs, and never the twain shall meet.
Racism there is out in the open. Racism here was not out in the open, but it was still racism.
My vision was for a more beautiful city. I was disappointed it wasn't as beautiful as the picture was painted. But I wasn't disappointed because opportunities was here.
Migrants often expected more than Chicago could deliver. If the new arrivals didn't have family or friends to help them make the transition, the city offered little assistance.
What kind of assistance could a black migrant expect here?
Not much. Not as much assistance, for example, as a white immigrant could expect, because many of the institutions that helped white immigrants, European immigrants when they came to Chicago, or white migrants from Minnesota or from Illinois or Iowa or whatever, didn't cater to blacks. Travelers and Immigrant Aid did help blacks. They would send them to the Urban League in most cases. The Urban League really was the organization that put together the kinds of assistance that migrants would often need. The Urban League found jobs for people, it found homes for people, and then most important was the assistance that people got from friends, relatives who were already here.
What kind of cultural adjustment was necessary when blacks first arrived here in Chicago?
Black Southerners in general lived in homes that were not as likely to have indoor plumbing, that were not as likely to have electricity. They had to get accustomed to the Chicago streetcar system. They had to get accustomed to very different kinds of work. If you worked on a southern farm, if you were a sharecropper or a wage laborer, you worked hard. You worked your tail off. You worked from dawn till dusk. But you didn't work on the same kind of schedule that you would work in a packing house or in a steel mill. You didn't punch a clock. The schools were very different. I mean, it's one of the reasons they went, was the schools were very different kinds of schools, but that would take some adjustment.
Betty Mae Tillman's parents and 9 children arrived in Chicago near the end of the 1920s. They enrolled in an educational system far superior to the one they left in Arkansas.
My parents were happy that we were able to go to school and get the education. That was the main focus, is to this is what my father said, that they were coming here so that he could educate his children.
You moved from a semi-rural to an urban environment. Did you have problems adjusting?
We did have adjustments to make. We were not accustomed to so many people. We were not accustomed to people not being friendly. It was a different kind of way of living.
The Southern carryover of focusing life around the family and the church was retained. So to that extent, the cultural shock wasn't as great because people had something to carry them through. But replacing the alarm clock, or rather replacing the rooster with the alarm clock, and the streetcar taking the place of walking, this is a major change in the lives of many people.
Beginning with the first wave of migration during World War I, most blacks moved north, seeking better economic opportunities. For the large unskilled labor force from the South, Chicago offered plenty of work.
When 1 or 2 went up there, and they going to apply for a job somewhere, and they said, where you from or where you home? Mississippi. You had that job. I didn't care how long the sky been there. So I said, no, Mississippi guy didn't know nothing but work. And he turned out more production than the guy was already been up there.
Curtis Coleman moved his wife and young family to Chicago in 1944, right at the beginning of the second great migrational wave. What led you to move to Chicago, Mr. Coleman?
The opportunity to better my life for myself and my family.
Were those expectations fulfilled?
It was really fulfilling. See, I worked with my hands, and I never was afraid of work. I was a chef or a cook, but I wasn't too good to wash dishes or to mop the floor.
As the entire labor force returned from the Second World War, competition for jobs increased, but there were still plenty of openings for blacks who were migrating in record numbers. Ruby Haynes came to Chicago in 1946 to stay with her aunt.
I remember one time I got hired on 3 different jobs in one day. Because I went to work that morning. If I didn't like it, I went to work at a laundry. And I didn't like that pressing, running those presses that fast. I went on down the streets and got hired at another place.
From the onset of the migrational surge in 1915, Chicago's black community went into a period of evolution that lasted 5 decades.
They brought with them different styles of music. They brought with them different inclinations about diet. They brought with them, to some extent, different attitudes towards interpersonal relations. Rural people are less formal than urban people. That's not South versus North. Rural people are more likely to hang out on their porches than urban people had. And this caused some controversy. The Chicago Defender printed lists of do's and don'ts. You know, don't act like this, don't act like that, don't wear head rags, don't eat watermelon in your front yard, much of which was stereotypes that unfortunately whites actually picked up. In many cases, they changed the city because they made it younger. And this was one thing I think that some people, in fact, misunderstood. They associated behavior with region or with class, which was really had a lot to do with age.
The South Side, you know, if Chicago was the capital of Black America, the South Side was the capital of Black America. The South Side was where, you know, the big institutions of Black Chicago were. The fancy homes along South Parkway, the big churches, the Ida B. Wells home, which was at that time a treasured institution, DuSable School, everything, Bill Dawson, the black boss of Chicago, everything was on the South Side. The West Side didn't have that kind of base of black institutional structure, and it really became very quickly more of an exclusively poor neighborhood, which it still is today.
The phenomenal growth of the black community during a short period of time threatened other ethnic groups. Friction often escalated into clashes or riots. After a brief break, we'll investigate some of the problems created by the Great Migration. Over the 50-year period that began in 1915, hundreds of thousands of Southern blacks relocated to Chicago. Some moved to the West Side, but most took up residence along a corridor called the Black Belt, which centered along South State Street. With this rapid influx of immigrants, the city experienced growing pains.
There was always racism in Chicago, but the smaller the number of blacks, the less obvious signs of racism were. I mean, there was a reason why most blacks lived south along State Street, because they weren't always welcome in other areas. But there were blacks sprinkled throughout the city, far south, west, some north. When the migrants got here, what they found is that they may have been welcomed into the stockyards as workers, but when it came time to, say, sharing recreational space at Washington Park and at smaller parks out south, friction could often result.
During the first major wave of migration from 1915 to 1919, Chicago's black population doubled from 50 to 100,000. Competition for jobs and real estate immediately irritated ethnic communities bordering the rapidly growing Black Belt.
When do we begin to see signs of white hostility to this burgeoning black community here in Chicago?
From the beginning. Virtually as soon as it became clear that large numbers of blacks were migrating into the city, the Chicago Tribune began printing headlines about problems in public health. They used metaphors which strongly implied that there were dangers to public health. Black Southerners inundating the city, raising problems in terms of overcrowding. They talked about overcrowding as a problem, but not in terms of, isn't it awful people are being overcrowded, but more in terms of the overcrowding in the Black Belt is going to is a breeding ground for disease. There was also fairly immediate hostility from the adjoining neighborhoods. Hyde Park to the east, Bridgeport and Canaryville to the west. As poor blacks from the South moved in, middle-class blacks tried to move away from them. I mean, this happens with every immigrant group.
Even then?
Even then. And so as poor blacks moved in, middle-class blacks would try to move to the edges of what was called the Black Belt, which created tensions at each of those edges.
How about tensions in the workplace?
The conflicts at the workplace involved unionism more than anything else at first. And some of this was really tragic misunderstanding. For example, unions always had ethnic locals. They were Polish locals in which none of the members would speak English, or very few of them, and the meetings would be conducted in Polish, or German locals. And so what the union leadership did was they permitted blacks to have their own local, self-determination in the lexicon of that era. Black Southerners, however, didn't see it as self-determination. They saw it as Jim Crow.
What a lot of blacks found, though, was that they didn't like what the union was selling and didn't quite believe in this policy of equality that some union leaders said was supposed to exist. Because some unions would still enlist blacks and have separate punch bowls at union functions. On the other hand, there were instances where there was one punch bowl and an outstretched hand from unions.
By the spring of 1919, racial tensions escalated into incidents of actual violence. In late July, a black teenager was murdered when he fell asleep on his raft and floated too close to a white beach on the south side. Full-scale riots ensued, injuring over 500 Chicagoans and killing 23 blacks and 15 whites.
There was political competition, there was competition over housing, there was competition over jobs. So in a sense, you had a situation in which violence was, if not inevitable, at least likely.
For blacks and whites involved in that confrontation, the scars may never heal. For the migrants who came later in the 40s and 50s, racism became more covert.
We still could not go across Cottage Grove. You was off limits, and I worked at the University of Chicago at 5959 Kimball, and that was during the time when the Navy was around out there. And we used to have to wear badges, and people think this is a lie, but this is the truth, to show why we was in that area at a certain time of night. And that was the impact of part of that racism when it surfaced, that you have a dividing line that's so close.
Well, in the South, racism was different. You knew the law. They told you the truth. Chicago, they won't tell you the truth. That's the only difference.
By the late 1950s, the expanding black community created serious overcrowding. Coupled with the flawed federal welfare system, portions of the promised land had become a ghetto. In the mid-60s, the federal government launched a war on poverty, aimed at cities like Chicago, who were suffering some of the ill effects of the migration.
All these war on poverty people that I talked to invariably said to me, please don't use Chicago as an example. Chicago was atypical because it was the only city where the mayor was able to get total control, almost total control of the funds. So in other cities where the mayor was not in control of the funds, the same kind of inner-city deterioration happened as happened in Chicago. So I don't think that whatever happened, Mayor Daley's role really, his most important role is in building the projects and trying to maintain residential segregation very strictly. I don't think that his own input into the war on poverty made that much difference one way or the other.
In October 1962, Ruby Haynes and her children became one of the first families to move into Robert Taylor homes. Their new public housing project on the south side was designed to relieve crowding in the black community.
And, you know, then you would have to know where the children's father was and bring him in to be willing to go, you know, stand for the rent thing.
What was Robert Taylor Homes like then?
It was nice then, but it got worse. You know, everything that got worse in the last 30 years. But it was nice. I used to go in and out of Robert Taylor at night. I always worked at night.
By 1978, Robert Taylor Homes was overrun with gangs, drug dealers, and unwed mothers. This predominantly black housing project became a symbol for the failures of the migration. After the mysterious death of a son and a near-fatal drug overdose by a daughter, Ruby Haynes returned to Clarksdale, Mississippi in 1979.
Now, we've pinpointed really the end of the migration as late 60s, mid-60s, late 60s. And I think the changing nature of the American economy as part of a global economy hastened the end of opportunities, economic opportunities. By the mid-60s, you had International Harvester closing down, the stockyards closing down, prominence in steel moving to Japan, West Germany, and the Soviet Union, prominent steel production, that is. The opportunities had just disappeared.
In a little over half a century, Afro-Americans transformed from a rural, agrarian race to a predominantly urban culture.
The migration was a success story on the whole. Most migrants are still in Chicago and doing much, much better than they were doing back in Mississippi or wherever they came from. And the whole thing, you know, worked out really quite well. For some, it didn't. But you know, the degree of preparation really depended on education. That's extremely important. How much education you had when you got here, or how much education you were able to get once you got here. And then to some extent, what kind of support system you had in your family.
The transition from rural to urban has been far from perfect, but few turned back.
We never thought in terms of going back.
I have been disenchanted with Chicago a lot of times, but I'm just not one to run away from nothing. I just don't believe you solve a problem by running away.
Over the last decade, Afro-American migration leveled off, and even a few of the original migrants returned to the South.
I didn't really want to go to Chicago. My idea was that I went to Chicago due to some relatives, and well, hey, it's better, you can make more money and that type of thing, and so I decided that I would go and try, so I did.
How'd you work out? How'd things work out?
Well, it was pretty nice for about 20 years, and then I decided that I wanted to get out of the fast pace and slow down, and so I moved back.
Were you happy in Chicago? I mean, there's things...
I love Chicago until a certain time, till up in the 70s. Then it just got so bad. I used to walk 2 blocks at night, 4 o'clock in the morning, get off the L and walk home and wasn't afraid then. But time got worse. I couldn't do that then.
Most blacks who migrated from the South stayed in Chicago. Afro-Americans have become an integral part of our city. The infrastructure established by black migrants and their ancestors built banks, corporations, and even took political reins of the city.
I stayed in Chicago because Chicago has so much to offer. You can find almost anything you want here in Chicago. Unfortunately, this seems to be disappearing to a certain extent.
Black America essentially reinvented itself from being a very rural culture, which it had always been, to being a very urban culture, unusually probably the most urban of America's various ethnic subcultures today. That's a big change, and it's just really starting to, the effects are just starting to be felt.
By the mid-70s, the Great Migration ended. Today, a slight reverse migration back south is underway. But no matter how many Chicagoans pack up and leave, the migrants and their ancestors, who now account for more than half of Chicago's population, have forever changed our city.